All right, it's 3 p.m., but I think we're maybe waiting for a couple other people to join, so we'll just wait a minute or two and then we will get started.
Hello.
Larry, is that you at the 901 number?
That's me.
All right, great. Thanks.
That is I.
Is there anyone else that we know that we're waiting on?
I think Chrissy is potentially going to join. We could probably go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, I'll turn it over to Michael in a moment, but first of all, welcome everyone to our first ever member learning session. The topic of this session is school letter grades, demographic data trends, and bright spots. I know you all know me. I'm Erica Light, the Director of Research for the State Board, and Michael is going to give a quick intro to just the concept of member learning sessions before we get started.
Thanks, Erica. Michael Derline, Deputy Executive Director of Policy and Research with the State Board. In a moment, I'll turn it back over to Erica, but I did want to spend just a few minutes today talking about the purpose of these member learning sessions and what we hope to accomplish today. As we have moved away from study committee meetings in favor of diversifying our workshop presentations, we've identified a gap in our ability to share timely and critical information on select topics in a way that allows for open discussion. Over the last year or so, we've generated a list of topics that members have expressed interest in learning more about. We surveyed members to better understand prioritization of these topics, and we have begun to develop our first sessions. This session was rated highest by the most number of members, and it will focus on analyses conducted related to school letter grades. We'll look at trends, characteristics of schools receiving B's and F's, and we will explore bright spots or schools that are bucking the trends. This conversation is especially timely as the board moves into facilitating hearings for certain schools that have received D's or F's. In the future, we will hear from education leaders both in Tennessee and across the nation. We are hopeful that these sessions will be engaging and help inform your policymaking. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Erica. Please know that we've built in some slides for discussion, but please feel free to ask clarifying questions if need be.
Great. First, just a quick overview of our agenda for today. Michael's already given our introduction to member learning sessions. So next, I'm going to discuss the school letter grade calculation, how the actual raw data is transformed into letter grades. Then we'll look at some trends over time and the relevance of school letter grades to accountability hearings. We will look at some demographic trends, climate and culture trends, and then finally, towards the end, we'll look at some bright spots, which we've identified a few schools that are performing exceptionally well, despite having some potentially challenging circumstances. And we will wrap up at the end with discussion, although as Michael mentioned, there will also be opportunities for questions and discussion throughout. First off, the school letter grade calculation. I expect that most of you are familiar with this, so I'm just going to go over this briefly just as a reminder. First of all, the school letter grade calculation includes several different indicators. There's the achievement indicator, the growth indicator, the Growth 25 indicator, and the College and Career Readiness, or CCR, indicator. The achievement indicator, as its name suggests, is a measurement of achievement levels, so students who are meeting or exceeding expectations on state assessments, and it does include all 4 core subject areas: ELA, math, science, and social studies. The growth metric is a school level TBOS composite metric, so that's measuring whether students are making expected growth from year to year in their academic performance, or whether they are making more than expected growth or less than expected growth. The Growth 25 measure is similar to the growth measure, except that it is specifically focused on the lowest performing 25% of students within each school. And that group of lowest 25%, lowest performing 25% is not necessarily the same group of students from school to school. Each school will have its own unique characteristics of that lowest 25% group. Finally, the College and Career Readiness indicator measures students who are meeting one or more of several different readiness criteria, and those are all listed here. We have, of course, ACT or SAT, or you can meet this criterion by getting a qualifying score on the ASVAB, getting certain industry credentials, or by earning post-secondary credits. One thing to note is all 4 of these indicators are measured on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. This metric, or this whole framework, is established by TDOE, and TDOE has previously presented to the state board about this framework.
Erica, I have a question.
Yes.
And please correct me if I'm wrong. When
1 to
David
5
presented on this, and so there may have been changes. The last time I remember a presentation from TDOE was that AP scores were in the achievement bucket if they were sort of replacing an EOC. If you were taking the AP lit test because you weren't taking the EOC for English, that it was actually in the achievement bucket. Is that correct?
That is the case in some circumstances where you can have an early post-secondary exam, like an AP exam, take the place of an achievement exam. The specific instances where that would occur are described in the 2023-24 school letter grade protocol. So I would
Okay, and
recommend
that's
you
the link
look
that
at
you
that.
have right there. Okay.
Yes, but it's my understanding it wouldn't prevent that score from also being used in the CCR indicator. So the ACT score or the AP score could potentially be used in both places, I think.
Okay. My concern there is around dual enrollment not being an achievement measure. If AP is, because we would have the data. But yeah, that's one that I can follow up with whoever you suggest about whether and how we could have a conversation about should dual enrollment be in the achievement rather than just the college and career if AP counts in achievement.
Okay, yeah, we can follow up about that and try to figure out who would be the best person to at TDOE to discuss that with.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Also, I just wanted to note before we move on from this slide, the college and career readiness measure is similar to the Ready Graduate metric, but it's not exactly the same. The Ready Graduate metric is used in federal accountability and has slightly different criteria. They overlap a lot, though. So there's a similar list of things that get you counted for the Ready Graduate indicator and for the college and career readiness indicator. It's just one of them is federal and the other one is a state accountability criterion. So this next slide here shows how the different indicators are weighted, and this differs a little bit depending on whether the school is a high school or not, because obviously only high schools are going to have that college and career readiness indicator. So schools that do not have the college and career readiness indicator are all evaluated using the K-8 weights. So the K-8 schools include both elementary schools, middle schools, and any school that's not a high school. And they will have 50% of their letter grade based on achievement, 40% based on growth, and 10% based on growth 25, which again is the growth for the 25% lowest performing students in that particular school. High schools have a same weight on achievement, but then for growth, they have 30%. Growth 25 is still 10%, and then that remaining 10% goes to the college and career readiness indicator. In order to go from the score on each indicator to the final letter grade score, the calculation shown on this screen here is applied to each indicator score. It's just applying the weights that were shown to each indicator score, and then you get the letter grade score, which is on a scale of 1 to 5, and then that numeric score is converted to a letter based on this table that is shown here. And all of this is also information is also available in the letter grade protocol, which I did have linked on an earlier slide, and which you also all had sent to you prior to this meeting. So looking at 23-24 letter grades, 23-24 was the second school year in which letter grades were produced. And in that year, we had a total of 290 schools got an A, 484 got a B, 508 got a C, 330 got a D, 78 got an F, and then a number of schools, quite a few schools actually were not eligible for a letter grade. And that's usually because they have the school is very small and doesn't have sufficient data to produce a letter grade, but also if a school is, for example, a K2 school and has no tested grades, that school would also not be eligible for a letter grade. So that's why we have a couple hundred schools there that aren't eligible, or schools that are brand new and don't have enough data yet would also not be eligible. So the chart on the right there shows the distribution of letter grades, and as we can see, F is thankfully the least common letter grade. We're glad to see that not a large percentage of schools are getting Fs, and hopefully we'll be able to see that percentage get even smaller in future years. So as I mentioned, we can now have 2 years of school letter grade data, and that allows us to start looking at trends over time. Overall, the distribution of letter grades looked very similar between 22-23 and 23-24. We had the same percent A's and the same percent F's, and there was only a little bit of shuffling around between B, C, and D. Looking at individual schools and how their grades changed, this chart is maybe a little bit difficult to read, but the easiest way to read this chart, I think, is to look across each row. So if you look at the row A for 2022-23 letter grades, you can see that schools that got an A in 22-23, most of them also got an A in 23-24. That was 58.8% of them also got an A in 23-24. And then 30.2% of them got a B, etc. So the bold numbers down the diagonal indicate schools that got the same grade in both years. Overall, about 45% of schools got the same grade in both years, and another almost 45% got either one higher or one lower than the previous year, with only about 10% moving by 2 or more letter grades. And that's generally good that we're seeing stability of letter grades. It indicates that it's capturing something that is not just a fleeting, a one-off incident, but more of an enduring characteristic of the school.
Erica, maybe you're going to show this, but those, 58%, so there's 42% didn't get the same grade. You said they got one higher, one lower. Do you have that difference? Were there more that got higher, shows were improving, or was there more that got lower, or statistically not a difference and it was just pretty well split?
I think it was pretty evenly split, but I can get that exact percentage for you after this meeting.
Yeah, that'd be helpful to know. Again, from a trend standpoint, are we progressing in the right direction or not? So that would be helpful.
Yeah. So of the schools that got A's, of course, none of them could have gotten higher the next year. So all of them got either the same or lower. But of course, in the middle, they could have moved either way. So this slide is just a reminder of why we're even talking about this. The school letter grades are important on their own, but they're also important in the context of accountability hearings, which are triggered by school letter grades. The state board will begin conducting accountability hearings in the 25-26 school year, so not too long from now, about a year from now. The accountability hearings rule, which is not yet finalized, but in the version that you all accepted on first reading back in February, it established criteria for which LEAs and public charter schools will be called for hearings. And according to that version of the rule, an LEA will be called for a hearing if it operates one or more public schools that received an F letter grade in 2 consecutive years, or dropped from a grade of D to F in 2 consecutive years. These same criteria will also apply to public charter schools, and in that case, the charter school will be called and its authorizer will also be called together for a hearing.
So basically what we're saying is that a school that previously was an F that went to a D, since that's 2 consecutive years, they would not be called for a hearing. Schools, the 20% of the schools that have a D, if they drop to an F, they would be called. And then the schools that had F both years would be called, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And so if a school was at an F and they went up to a D, we obviously would like to see them continue to improve and not stay at a D, but they would not be called in that particular year. Okay. So based on the 2 years of data we have so far, which are not the same 2 years of data we're going to actually be using for accountability hearings, but it's the data that we have available at the moment. If we use the data we currently have to determine who was eligible for hearings, then we would end up calling 24 LEAs and 7 public charter schools for a hearing. And most of the LEAs in this group, 16 out of the 24, have just one school that meets the criteria for a hearing. And out of those 16, only 5 of them have only their virtual school as the school that is causing them to be called for a hearing. So that was just one trend that we noticed in the data that we wanted to point out. So before we move into some of the demographic and other trends, we just have a few questions here to help to frame the discussion. First of all, as we're going through this presentation, think about how these data affect what you're thinking about accountability hearings. And based on these data, what questions would you want to ask an LEA or a public charter school that's called for a hearing? And then finally, what additional information or context would you want to hear about our lowest performing schools that are being called for a hearing? We will circle back to these questions at the end, so we'll have an opportunity to discuss them more once we've gone through the remainder of the slides. All right, moving on now into demographic trends. We'll start with economically disadvantaged. So this table and chart shows the characteristics of A schools, B schools, C schools, D schools, and F schools regarding or with regard to the percentage of economically disadvantaged students that they serve. We can see that A schools, well, actually for all of the grade levels, they range broadly from having a very low percentage of economically disadvantaged students up to a very high percentage. We do, however, see a trend in the median. So the typical school or the average school that got an A has 17% economically disadvantaged students, or schools it would probably be better to say schools that got an A on average had 17% economically disadvantaged students. Although in this case, I use the median rather than the mean just because there are schools that are at either less than 5 or greater than 95 that have their data suppressed. And so we know that they're less than 5 or greater than 95, but we don't know exactly what they are, which is why I calculated the median. But that still allows us to see the trend. And you can see there's a clear upward trend, whereas the grades get worse, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students on average goes up. But you can also see from the range that this is not true for all schools. There are schools at all grade levels who have both low and high economically disadvantaged students. Moving into Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, we see a similar trend to what we saw with economically disadvantaged students, although in this case, the minimum to maximum range is even more stark. You can see that it runs for every single grade level. The entire range is present, from less than 5% to greater than 95%. So we have schools with all combinations of different racial and ethnic groups that are performing very well and also performing not as well. Again, we see the upward or the trend in the median, where as you move from A down to F, there's an increasing median percentage of students who are Black, Hispanic, or Native American. And this, I know that you are all aware of this, but in our state, students of color and students who are economically disadvantaged are highly correlated with each other. So the fact that this shows the same trend as economic disadvantage is not very surprising. Moving on now to students with disabilities, we don't see as clear of a trend with these students. There is about the same percent of students with disabilities on average across all school letter grades. And the range is pretty wide as well for each letter grade.
Erica, I've got a question about the
Mhm.
not only just disadvantaged / students of color slide.
Mhm.
The median, and apologies if you had said this, but the median percentage students, what is that referring to? Like how do we, what does that data point mean?
So going back to this one, to this slide, if we look at A schools, so the median A school has 20%, or had in 23-24, they had 20% Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. So many A schools had a higher percentage than that, and well, exactly half of A schools had a higher percentage than that, and half had a lower percentage than that. So right in the middle, the median A school had 20% Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. Does that make sense?
Sorted by the percentage of students up with those ethnicities. So like,
Yes.
because it could be sorted by like academic performance or where they fall in the A through F. But it's, if you look at all the A schools and you say for each of them you have their percentage with those students and you plot those out, then the one in the middle is 20% Black, Hispanic, and Native American.
Yes, that's correct. So they're arranged in order from fewest Black, Hispanic, and Native American students to most, and right in the middle of the A schools is 20%. I'm sorry if that was unclear earlier.
No, that's very helpful. I mean, what is our takeaway? And I apologize, I had to join late, so I also, are we allowed to have a discussion here and ask? Okay,
Yes, we can have a discussion.
great. I wasn't sure what the rules of the meeting and everything. So, you know, I remember all the discussion leading up to the formula for the AF school determination about, you know, growth versus achievement, proficiency, and the balance that was struck there. And you know, my recollection was part of that was because we didn't want the schools. I don't know if I want to say it so directly, is like it essentially to be a measurement of the demographics from which the school's students would come. But it appears that's what we have, at least from this chart. And so I don't know if there have been discussions about that, or if kind of what if this is measuring appropriately what we believe we should be measuring with the formula for AF schools.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. We will be getting in a few minutes into like each of the separate indicators that make up the letter grades and how those trend with demographics. And then we'll be able to see which indicators are driving this overall trend that we're seeing here, and how that's related to the way that the indicators are weighted in the model, which, as I mentioned previously, I don't recall if you had joined at this point or not, but the actual model itself, as you know, is set by TDOE. So we are not directly in control of this model, but we certainly can have discussions about what aspects of the model might be leading to the trends that we're seeing.
Can I add, Erica, to Ryan? I don't know if you caught this point that Erica made about this trend in particular. And Erica, please correct me if I misstate this, but that it's actually being driven more by economic disadvantage than anything else. And that, you know, there are, because we're seeing over on the left-hand side, you see on the table, the min and max, we're seeing schools just across all letter grades with very high proportions of students of color and very low. So this one's a little, while there is a trend, especially on the higher end, it's more so the case that it's being driven by the previous slide around economic disadvantage. But even there, right, if you look at A's, B's, and C's, there are schools, and we'll talk about this later on in this presentation, there are schools that are kind of bucking those trends and are certainly bright spots. And that's where eventually we want to dig in and figure out what are they doing.
Yeah. The median data point, while helpful, maybe is obscuring the fact that there are schools with a lot of economically disadvantaged students that are A's, and schools with very few economically disadvantaged students that are D's and F's.
Yes, that is why I have this table here in addition to the chart, because although maybe the table's not as eye-catching as the chart, it shows that we do have, at every grade level, a broad range of demographics.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. The last
Erica,
student group. Sorry.
Go back up one chart.
Back to this one.
No, down. You're disabled.
Oh, the students with disabilities. Okay.
Yeah, right. So the point that you made there is there's really not a large difference from A, B, C, D, or F based on students present. I think it would be helpful though if you plotted on top of that in a different color what the overall averages are. And I think you would still, at that point in time, you would see that there's a higher percentage of F, because it weren't overall, it's like 5% F or something like that, right? And 20%. Is that correct?
So the percentages on here are not referring to the percentage of schools that got Fs. I'm sorry if that was confusing. It's referring to the typical F school had 14% students with disabilities. The typical A school also had 14% students with disabilities. So it's not actually showing you how many schools got an F. It's more showing you the characteristics of the schools that got an F.
We have schools across the state that are focused on, deaf or blindness, et cetera. So it'd be interesting to know how those would rate, or do they get scored?
I can tell you that the Tennessee School for the Blind and the Tennessee Schools for the Deaf are not eligible for letter grades because of lack of sufficient data to calculate it. There are other schools in the state that are not that specific, but do have a high percentage of students with disabilities that may be eligible for a letter grade. But those in particular, those state special schools, are not eligible.
Erica, this might be a question for DOE. Can we disaggregate any of the students with disabilities to know perhaps schools that are doing a particularly good job with different types of disabilities, or is the indicator kind of a group?
So with the data that is available to me, I'm not able to disaggregate different types of disabilities. It's possible that the Department of Education might be able to do that, but I just have basically an indicator of what percentage of students with
Okay,
disabilities
so
they had.
you don't get the pieces of it. Okay, I was just wondering if as we're thinking about this, if there are schools that serve particular groups well, that might be a place to dig in. But yeah, if you can't disaggregate that, thanks.
Yeah, that makes sense because we do have students with disabilities is a huge range of different types of students with very different needs.
And I don't want to jump ahead, but to Michael's point about, you know, there are some schools within each of these different demographics that are doing well and not doing well. I wonder if there would be an opportunity for us to, maybe in the context of the hearings or not, to kind of pair up or identify best practices from the schools that are doing well that look like schools that are not doing well in a lot of ways, so that they could draw from what is succeeding in a similar school. You know, it might be that a rural school in a certain area is not like an urban school, but that, you know, you find urban schools are doing well and not doing well, and rural schools are doing well and not doing well, and all under all sorts of ways of sorting the data. So I don't know if there's any value to that, but it occurred to me. I want to throw it out.
I think there's all kind of value in that, Ryan. I totally agree. Is that, you know, the beauty of getting this data is that we can now use it, and we can look at those schools that are doing well and do lessons learned, and what can we take from one school to the other. I think that's maybe what Victoria was looking at too on some of her questions. So what is it that the schools are doing well that have A's, B's, that are like schools, whether it's rural, urban, or whatever, compared to those that are getting D's and F's? What are they doing differently? So.
Thanks. Okay, the last student group that we looked at for this, which these were all based on what student groups were available in the data that we have. So the last group we have is English learners. And we also see kind of a similar trend here where the minimum and the maximum are pretty far apart on all different grade levels. So we have a wide range at every grade level, but there is overall a trend similar to what we saw with economically disadvantaged and students of color. One thing to note on this slide is that about 39% of schools in Tennessee have fewer than 10 students with disability, or sorry, not students with disabilities, English learners. They have fewer than 10 English learners, which means we don't actually have data reported on their percentage of English learners. It's suppressed for privacy reasons. So this chart and table is only including those schools that have 10 or more English learners, which is about 60% of our schools at this point. Okay, now getting to what Mr. Holt was discussing or bringing up earlier, we're going to look at some of the specific indicators, or rather each of the specific indicators that are included in letter grades and demographic trends that we see for those. Starting with the achievement indicator, which is weighted at 50% for both high schools and K through 8 schools. So this is the most heavily weighted of any indicator in the letter grade framework. On average, we see that schools with lower achievement indicator scores serve more economically disadvantaged students. A reminder that on all of these numeric indicators, 5 is a good score and 1 is a bad score. So we want to see more schools getting up toward 5. Schools with lower achievement indicator scores also serve more students of color and English learners, but this is mostly because of the correlation between those student groups and economic disadvantage. On the other hand, there's not a clear relationship between the achievement indicator score and the percentage of students with disabilities. So sort of like we saw with the overall letter grades, there was not a clear relationship there. And there's not a clear relationship with the achievement indicator either. Moving on to the growth indicator, we see a very different pattern here, which is that there's not a significant relationship between the growth indicator score and the percentage of economically disadvantaged students. We also didn't see a significant relationship between the growth indicator and any of the other student groups. It just seems that overall the growth indicator is not strongly related to student demographics. Moving on to the growth 25 indicator, we saw an interesting trend here, which is that schools with higher growth 25 indicator scores have on average more students of color and more English learners. So this is actually showing the reverse of the trend that we saw on the achievement indicator, except not for economically disadvantaged students, interestingly. So the scores on this indicator were not related to economic disadvantage, and they were not related to students with disabilities, but they were related to students of color and English learners in the opposite direction to what we saw with the achievement indicator.
Erica, so just to ensure I understand this, probably going to bungle it. That schools that have a higher percentage of students of color, so long as they are not economically disadvantaged, saw more growth than schools that did not. Is that right?
I think that's approximately right. Where this is not like directly, this graph is not directly controlling for economically disadvantaged because it's looking at each of them separately. But if I had made this graph for economic disadvantage, it would have looked kind of like the graph we saw on the previous chart where all the bars are the same height. So really, we don't exactly know what is driving this trend. We haven't been collecting this indicator for very long, and therefore we've not had very much opportunity to investigate what might be causing this trend. So this was definitely something we should look into more in the future, and maybe also do more in-depth analyses where we do specifically control for multiple characteristics simultaneously, which I've started to look at as well, but that will be even more useful once we have more years of data available.
Thank you.
And finally, we have the college and career readiness indicator. We saw an interesting trend here as well, which is that on average, schools with lower college and career readiness indicator scores have more students of color. And in this case, this was true even after we controlled for economic disadvantage. And that seemed to be driven largely by early post-secondary opportunities. So what we seem to be seeing was that even after you account for economic disadvantage, schools that have more students of color had fewer students completing early post-secondary opportunities, which we assume, though we haven't directly been able to verify this, is related to opportunities that are available to those students. So that's definitely something that we want to look more into in the future, and something that we could be asking about in the context of hearings is what type of early post-secondary opportunities are offered to students in these schools that are coming to see us for hearings.
Going back to Ms. Harpool's question, her question had to do with dual enrollment for the achievement score. They do get credit for dual enrollment for college and career readiness indicator. Is that correct?
Yes, that's counted as an early post-secondary opportunity as long as they pass the dual enrollment class. Anyway, so circling back to what Mr. Holt brought up earlier regarding the demographic trends in the overall grades, we've now seen the trends in each of the individual indicators, and you can see that some of them seem to at least partially counteract each other. But you also at the same time need to keep in mind the weight that is put on each indicator. And therefore, the trends that are seen in the indicators that have more weight on them are going to be more evident in the overall letter grades, as opposed to the trends seen in the indicators that have less weight put on them. Okay, the next section gets into some information about chronic absenteeism and teacher credentials and retention. So before we move on to that, were there any final questions or discussion about this demographic section?
I know you guys are thinking with a mind to some of the hearings, but if there's any assistance we can provide, knowing that we're a state with a fairly high investment in dual enrollment and AP access, to have such a correlation between economically disadvantaged and low EPSO participation rate, we're happy to do what we can to help you guys examine maybe what's going on, or be of assistance where needed. Just because there's a disconnect there for students, and that's unfortunate.
All right, thank you. Okay, moving on to some trends related to culture and climate. Starting with chronic absenteeism. As a reminder, chronic absenteeism measures the percentage of students who are absent for 10% or more of instructional days. And as we can see in this chart, the rate of chronic absenteeism in F schools is about 2.5 times higher than in A schools. Just so you have a point of comparison, the average, statewide average chronic absenteeism rate in 23-24 was 18.9%. So that's in between the average for B schools and the average for C schools. And then A schools have, on average, lower than the state average chronic absenteeism, whereas D and F schools have notably higher than the state average of chronic absenteeism.
Chronic absenteeism is defined by a specific number of days, like 10 days or something like that. Did you look at correlate it with the number of days absent? In other words, those that are absent 10 days, those that are chronically absent based on 10 days versus 20 days versus 30 days?
I unfortunately did not have access to that level of detail, just whether this, what percentage of students were considered chronically absent or not, which in most districts would be about 18 days you would need to be absent for the school year, although that depends on how long, like if a student enrolled in the middle of the school year, they could potentially be chronically absent with fewer than 18 days missed. But if they were enrolled for the whole school year, it would be about 18 days. And unfortunately, I can't see if some students had far more than 18 days and what that trend might have looked like for those students. Okay, next I have some data on teacher retention. So this is looking at teacher retention in terms of teachers who stayed in the same school. Not necessarily in exactly the same teaching position, but in the same school. The average for all Tennessee schools in 23-24 was 76.9% teacher retention. So that's actually exactly equal to the average for C schools. Whereas A schools and B schools had above average retention, and D schools and F schools had below average retention, again, on average. I unfortunately don't have a table for all of these, but I'm sure that within each one of these, similar to what we saw with the demographic trends, there are some A schools that had lower than 82% retention, and some F schools that had higher than 60% retention, but we do see a trend overall. Also, just a quick reminder, 100% retention is not necessarily the goal that we're going for here, because sometimes a teacher is not a good fit for a particular school and needs to move to a different school or a different district in order to really find a position that fits their skill set well. So we don't want to have zero teacher turnover, but having too much teacher turnover can be disruptive to learning. Next, looking at teacher experience and credentials. We have here the average percentage of inexperienced teachers for schools with each letter grade. And this is defined as teachers who have less than 2 years of experience. So if you're in your first year of teaching or your second year of teaching, you're considered an inexperienced teacher for this purpose. And we see a very clear trend here where F schools on average have far more inexperienced teachers than A and B schools, and even notably more than C and D schools. In terms of teachers who have emergency credentials, this includes both teachers who have a permit or also teachers who have an endorsement exemption or waiver. And the rate of teachers with emergency credentials in F schools is approximately 7 times higher than in A schools. One notable thing here is that this data, unfortunately, is not detailed enough to capture what positions these inexperienced or emergency credentialed teachers are in. So we don't know, for example, if a school has an emergency credentialed teacher teaching in a core subject or teaching an elective, or if they have their inexperienced teacher teaching in a tested grade or an untested grade. We can't see that level of detail from the data that we have here. Also, would like to note before we move on that not all inexperienced teachers are necessarily ineffective. We do have some very, very effective teachers who are very early in their career. It's just that we know that on average, teachers gain effectiveness rapidly during their first few years in the classroom, which is why we'd like to retain them and keep them in there for longer than just the first 2 years. All right, I guess before I pass off to my colleagues to discuss some bright spots that we saw in the data, any questions or discussion regarding the teacher and absenteeism data?
Is there any correlation between inexperienced and emergency credentials? Those teachers that are don't have the 2 years but are working on teaching on emergency credential or waiver?
So I can't look at that directly in the data that I have, but I assume that most of the teachers who are on emergency credentials are also inexperienced, because if we have like a limit on how long you can be on an emergency credential. So that limit is the 3 years. So technically someone could be in their 3rd year teaching on a permit, and they would no longer be considered an inexperienced teacher, but they would still be considered as a teacher on an emergency credential. But for most of those teachers who are on their 1st or 2nd year on a permit, unless they had previous teaching experience somewhere else that for some reason did not allow them to get a license in Tennessee, they would also be an inexperienced teacher.
Right, so maybe I missed them, because I was thinking that if teachers aren't, say if they're a math teacher, certified in K through 6, but we go ahead, because we're short of math teachers, we let them teach 7th and 8th grade. Is that not under emergency credential or something, or am I missing?
Sorry, yes, that would be included under a waiver or endorsement exemption. I can pull that data separately from the permits and get that to you, but I can tell you from overall trends that the vast majority of the emergency credential teachers were teaching on permits, which means they didn't have a license in any subject area. A relatively small percentage of them were on waivers, which means they do have a license, but it's not in the area that they're currently teaching.
That might be helpful to have the information, so we know the impact of waivers. Is there a correlation there between waivers versus performance?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Hey, Erica,
Mhm.
while discussing teacher data here, are there any numbers to suggest like the teacher effectiveness in each of these schools? I mean, do we have a school that has a letter grade of A and the teachers that are teaching in those grade bands that help generate that data, you know, are they a level 3, 4, or 5 teacher? Or do we have a school that has earned a letter F grade, but yet maybe the majority of their teachers have an effectiveness of a 3, 4, or 5, and then, you know, try to figure out, there's obviously then a disconnect that maybe we could dig deeper into. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, that type of teacher evaluation data is not publicly available. It does exist in some databases that the Tennessee Department of Education has, although how closely it can be matched to like specifically what classes teachers are teaching, I'm unsure about that. But they certainly would know what school the teacher is teaching in. So we could potentially talk to a TDOE about that question. Okay, moving into some bright spots. These are a few schools, or 3 schools, that we had found are performing very well despite having some of demographic characteristics and other characteristics that are would make it difficult for them to perform well, but they're performing well regardless. And so we wanted to highlight these schools and try to learn more about what they're doing in order to get the outstanding results that they have seen. For this section, I'm going to pass off the presentation to my colleagues, Michael Derline and Allie Reed.
Thanks, Erica. So the first school we looked at was Burks Elementary in Putnam County. In 2023-24, they received an A. And I'll give you all a minute just to look at their indicator scores, demographics, culture and climate. But essentially they are, indicator scores are all pretty high. Their demographics, they're very much higher than the state average of economic disadvantage. Students of color is around the state average. ELs is a little bit above. Students with disabilities is right on the state average. Chronic absenteeism rate is a little bit lower. Teacher retention rate is a little bit higher. Inexperienced teachers is a little bit lower than the state average, and they have no teachers on emergency credentials. So we had a brief conversation with them to try and learn a little bit more about what it is they believe is helping drive their outcomes. And about 4 years ago, they had a leadership change, and that prompted the development of a 5-year climate and academics plan for moving from a lower performing school to an A and a reward school. They track progress, make adjustments each year, and work with the school and community members to develop, define, communicate, and hold everyone accountable to that plan. They have some non-negotiables for educators: student-centered decision-making, professionalism, and using high quality and standards-aligned curriculum and instruction. They also have some non-negotiables for their leadership team: being in classrooms with curriculum and instruction focus, regular educator collaboration opportunities, a strong belief in all students and a culture of learning, and leveraging different strengths as a leadership team. And they invest in their growth to serve better. So we've learned a little bit about this. It's just a kind of a snapshot into these schools and how we're seeing that there are certainly schools that are bucking the trend, and we're learning a little bit more about what they're doing. The next school is Whitehaven High School. It's in Memphis Shelby County Schools. In 23-24, they received an A. You'll see that they have the highest indicator scores across the board. Their demographics are interesting as well. They are pretty high economically disadvantaged, over 95% students of color, a pretty small percentage of English learners, and a smaller than state average percentage of students with disabilities. Their chronic absenteeism rate is a little bit higher than the state average. Their teacher retention rate is about on par with the state average. They have slightly lower than state average inexperienced teachers and higher use of emergency credentials. Unfortunately, we could not reach the administrators at Whitehaven, but I did pull some information from their website, which has a lot a lot of videos sharing some of the work that they're doing, especially around integrating ELA and literacy skills across the school. They have a common planning period for ELA teachers. They have an annotation guide focused on literacy across all classes. There's a desire to take challenging texts, some of the more older texts that they're using, and apply them to real world contexts and careers. And they have a strong connection between high school and college and career readiness. So they have a business finance program, an ACT and PSAT curriculum, and a lot of opportunity for honors, dual enrollment, AP courses, and dozens of industry certifications. I'll pass it over to Allie.
Thank you. This third school that we wanted to highlight is also a school that received a letter grade of an A last school year. This is Kip Antioch College Prep Middle School. They are currently authorized by the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission, but some of you may remember they were previously authorized by the state board, and that switched over in 2021 to the newly formed at the time Charter Commission. So their indicator scores, they have a 4 in achievement and 5 in growth of the lowest 25%. You can see their demographics here, large English learner population, higher students of color percentage here. And then in their culture and climate, low chronic absenteeism, teacher retention rate sitting at 60%. So that's one of those that Erica pointed out that sometimes we have, we saw that as the average for F schools, and this school had an A with 60%. And so just with the data that we see here and their outcome, did not have an opportunity to connect with the leadership, but did have an opportunity to speak with the staff at the Charter Commission, their authorizer, and just to learn a little bit more about what they believe is leading to or driving the successes that they're seeing. First and foremost, they mentioned the consistency and strong culture that the school has established, and that is through intentional vertical alignment and collaboration with their feeder elementary school. They work really closely together. They're regularly meeting and ensuring that students have a really seamless transition between the two schools. They also have spent a really intentional focus on talent recruitment in the last few years, and they have a team that is a pretty robust team that's establishing relationships with local universities and community organizations. They've also established a leadership development program for rising leaders that's focused on professional development for leadership as well as coaching supports. They even offer teacher and leader residency programs, and so they are directly working with their incoming leaders, their up-and-coming leaders, their rising leaders, to get them to be familiar with the school, to be familiar with the work before they actually take on those leadership positions. And then last but not least, just wanted to highlight that they're prioritizing EL certifications, even going as far as paying for those endorsements and hiring associate teachers with the expectation that those individuals will be pursuing dual licensure in EL and 5/8 education.
Okay. Thank you, Michael and Allie. So now you're welcome to ask any questions you have about these bright spots, although we may not have the answers and may need to further circle back with the school. But I also want to circle back to the discussion questions that we had earlier regarding how this data affects how you're thinking about accountability hearings, what questions you would like to ask an ELA or public charter school that's called for a hearing, and what additional data or context you would like to see for schools that are called for hearings.
Erica, before we do that, could you go back up one slide? Allie, it was interesting. You talked about what they were doing in leadership development and hiring teachers. When you look at teacher retention rate of 60%, if a person is a teacher and then they become a support person, I don't know can't remember what you call the next level, where they're not in the classroom teaching, but they're, they may be an administrative person or they may be a coach or something like that. Do they still count as the teacher, as a teacher in your teacher retention, or is that a factor where that teacher is no longer considered a teacher, and that may be skewing that 60% number?
Yeah, that's a good question. Erica, you might have to help me out. I don't remember if the retention rate accounts for those shifts. Erica, do you know?
It wasn't entirely clear in the file that I pulled this data from, but my assumption, and I can follow up with CDOE on this because it's their data file, is that if their employee classification was no longer teacher, they would probably count as having not been retained, because this file was looking specifically at teacher retention. So that would be something that we would be interested in knowing, is if the teacher says they're not retained, but they're actually still there and they're now in a leadership position. That would be useful to know.
Go back to your questions now. Sorry.
So I think at this point, we'll just open it up to you all. Feel free to go in any order, but really just wanted to have a conversation related to these topics or any other discussion points that you all want to bring up. But we are thinking ahead to our accountability hearings, and if you are going to be receiving data similar to this, what questions might come to mind? What might we want to dig in more on? What additional information might we want to receive in preparation for these hearings?
While the other
Ally?
board members are thinking of their
Sorry,
questions,
Mel.
I'm sorry, Sarah, were you gonna say
I was
something?
gonna do the same thing. Go ahead. That's something while people were thinking, but you go. I'll
Okay.
follow you.
I was first gonna say, this is outstanding. I mean, really, really, obviously, you've spent a lot of time looking at the data, and that is so important as we determine where we are, where we want to go, and how we want to get there. And so, thank you for everything you've done. Obviously, we've seen some things that, you might want to look at to increase that data knowledge, but just thank you for what you've done. I mean, this is really, really good start. And I think having that data will help us develop the questions that we want to develop and we want to ask as we look for we want these hearings to be positive. We want to use them to improve those letter grades for the school. So as we see the data and we compare it to the schools that are doing so well, we can ask the questions, what are they doing differently? And I think the information that Ally presented and Michael presented on those 3 schools that are doing things differently, how do we take that and move that into the schools that aren't doing so well? So thank you for everything you're doing. I'll sit back and think about some questions. I'll turn it back over to Sarah and then to others.
No, thank you for that, Bob. I could not agree more. Erica is such an asset to our team, and presentations like this give her the chance to showcase all that she can do, but she's just always behind the scenes crunching data for us on you name it issues. And so it goes without saying, but members, if you have questions about things that you're wondering about data and anything related to K-12, Erica is a huge asset and always really welcomes those requests and conversations. So yeah, she's been really working hard helping us think about this. I also just wanted to, some of the comments before, to flag, we heard in November from Shelby County in partnership with Cognia, some work that they're doing to, see some positive results in schools that have been historically failing, looking at that third-party partner and sort of those short kind of cycles of data study and improvement, and looking, closely at data regularly. Seemed to be one thing that jumped out. And then, we're going to be looking in May at a couple additional presentations and just trying to think about, feeding these learning opportunities to our staff and board ahead of the hearing so that we can hone in on what is happening, what are the sort of playbooks as they come together in schools that are bucking the trend in terms of some of these data points. And so I think that'll be important to help us think about the kinds of questions and the things that we want to uncover as part of the hearings. But Ally and Michael, do you want to spend any time just briefly highlighting who we're going to hear from in May, as people are kind of thinking about their questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to. We have Metro Nashville Public Schools joining us. They have really upped their leadership development and have a leadership framework that they're going to be sharing with us. And they, as a district, have received a TVOS Level 5 3 years in a row, and are really excited and proud of the work that they're doing. And so they will be joining us at the workshop in May. And we also have invited TNTP. They recently released a report. They're a national education organization, and they recently released a report called the Opportunity Makers. And they took a look at several schools around the country that are all very different from each other, but who are changing the trajectory for students. And what do they have in common? And so that is what that report covers. They're going to be sharing the outcomes that came from it. And I hope that you will see a lot of what we're thinking about and working on regarding our hearings aligns to some of the outcomes that they were finding. And then we also, related to that, one of the schools that was part of this year-long research project that they conducted is one of our very own from Trousdale County. So Director Clint Satterfield will also be joining to share about his experience and what's happening in just a Tennessee context. So really excited for both of those presentations in May.
Okay, so I do have a couple of thoughts, questions, if we're to that part. Thank you, Erica and Michael and Allie. This was really, really great information. So just some things that randomly floated through my mind as you were presenting, especially with the demographic trends. So I'm wondering, with TISA and the outcomes money that's generated when certain demographic groups perform well, I'm wondering, I don't know how deep we want to get into something like that, but, if we have obviously a school that's not performing well and they are generating outcomes money, are they investing that outcomes money back into that demographic group? Or is it because they have such a great need somewhere else? Is there I don't know. I just would find that very interesting. If you're generating outcomes money for students of color or students with disabilities or English learners, and you still have a great need there, but then that outcomes money, it's going somewhere else. And I know we can't, and I'm not trying to say that I even want to tell people what to do. I'm just saying that would be very interesting. Also, I wonder, with like the A schools, well, all of the letter grade schools, what are their grade band breakdowns? Are 50% of all letter A schools K5s, or are they traditional K8s, or are they, I would find it interesting, the grade bands of those schools. And also, going back to the demographics, what types of opportunities are available? And you all said this, for those students that are not reaching those career and college and career readiness indicators, do they have plans to offer more things? Which students are enrolled in those classes that carry credentialing? Just some general questions like that. And after I've slept on this, I'm sure I will have more.
Well, thank you for those questions, Ina. I can say, regarding your second question, I did look for with the grade bands, if the high schools had a different letter grade distribution compared to the K-8 schools, since they do have a slightly different formula. And I saw there was not any significant difference. The distribution of letter grades was almost the same for high schools as it was for K-8 schools. I did not look more specifically within K-8 schools to see if like elementary schools were doing better than middle schools, or if schools that have all the grades K-8 were doing differently than other schools, etc. I could potentially look into that, though, because we do have data in the letter grade file about what grade bands not necessarily every single specific grade level, but what grade bands each school has.
I've got a couple other comments if, unless Ryan or Larry want to go first. All right, I'll make a couple comments. I think this is, again, great data, and this is data across the state for several schools. What I'm going to be interested in is that specific school that we're looking at. What is the data for the school that resulted in the D or F rating? And then I think you got to break it down even more and say, okay, is it because of achievement? I mean, if you look at your calculation, achievement's 50%, blah, 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 blah. Is achievement a low score and career and college readiness is a high score? And so I'm going to be asking or looking at where are the weak areas within the school, and then asking them, going back to Ina's comment with regard to how the money is being spent, is there a focus to bring that area up within the funds that are being spent, or within, what are your focus areas in your particular school to bring up the areas that are obviously bringing you down, keeping you at a D or F rating? And so it's going to the next level or two down in the data. Is it English scores? Is it math scores? Is it EPSOs? What is it? And what are you doing about that to bring that up? Those are kind of some of the questions. And what then, and if it is reading scores or something, then you go to this, okay, the school over here is doing outstanding in reading. It's not just the school is doing outstanding. Find a school that's doing really, really well in reading, and what are they doing differently than what I'm doing?
Thanks, Mr. Eby. That a lot of what you were just discussing is the type of data that we're going to have in our pre-hearing paperwork that the state board members will be able to see prior to a school or an LEA rather being brought for a hearing. And it will be down at that individual school level, unlike the data in this presentation, which was obviously much more summarized. Although one thing I can say from looking at the summarized data is we saw generally, in order to get an A, you pretty much had to have high scores on all of the indicators. And similarly, in order to get an F, you needed to have low scores on pretty much all the indicators. Schools that had a mixture of high and low indicator scores were usually in the B, C, or D range.
That makes some sense. The other thing is, we're going to have the hearings for the Fs and D and Fs, et cetera. Hopefully the other schools that are in the D or, don't qualify for the hearing range, that are in the D range or in the C range, are working using the data and looking at the data to see what they can do to get up to the B and the A range.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Of course, if you think of questions or comments later, you can always send those to us.
And just buying you a couple more minutes to think if there's anything else people want to share. Allie mentioned the workshop presentations that are upcoming, but we would love your continued thoughts about what other presentations or data points or practice sharings that we could kind of facilitate ahead of next spring that would help inform people's thinking. So if there are things that you'd like us to be thinking about for August, I know Allie and Michael are always like forward mapping a lot of that by a number of months. So whenever you have thoughts like that, it's helpful to us as we're thinking about how to use our time at upcoming workshops and other future learning sessions like this.
Well, I was going to say that this learning session certainly exceeded my expectations. And I look forward to similar learning sessions on other topics because it really does. I think it's serving its purpose, allowing us to drill down and get information that we can't get in a board meeting or even a workshop or whatever. And so well done and keep them coming. And I look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Mr. Holt, Dr. Maxwell, any final comments?
I
Thank
guess-
you. And this was wonderful.
Yeah, I would echo Bob and Ina. This is really well done. Thank you, Erica, for your great work on this and everyone on the team. It's really helpful to get this data and have it analyzed in so many ways and presented in an easy to understand manner like this. I think just to Sarah's point of other information, and we touched on some of it today, but just continuing to think about like what are the themes of best practices that run through the A schools that we are seeing. How do we distill that down so that we can try to use it at the hearings? So it's not just, hey, we're hauling, these D and F schools in front, but we've got some real like data backed real world contemporary examples of things that are proving to be successful with like populations and like schools. I think it's hard to pick, like what's the secret sauce that makes for a good school. There's not like this is the answer, but I guess that's my push is for continuing to kind of refine that, distill that into like what are the key items that we want to be able to share out, that this is what we're seeing in schools like yours that are performing at the highest level.
That was very well said, Ryan. And I think if we keep student success as our focus at the center of everything that we do, it will be a positive outcome for everyone. And I just really look forward to those best practices that are going to come to light that everyone sometimes works, you get so busy doing the work that you don't have time to step back and reflect and look at what others are doing. So hopefully this will be a growth opportunity for everyone. Not just the schools called before us, but even our other letter grade schools.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we can declare this member learning session completed. Hope you all
Thanks
have a
again,
good rest of
Erica.
your afternoon.
Michael, Allie, and Ina, Victoria, Ryan, Larry for a little while for joining. Really appreciate all the engagement. So look forward to some continued conversations on these topics.